Part 5. The Fixers. Before we name the fixers, you need to hear from the woman who saw them up close. She filed her affidavit under the name Tiffany Doe. She signed it under penalty of perjury. And in it, she described not just what Jeffrey Epstein did, but who ran the machine that made it possible. Tiffany Doe described being hired through a female assistant. She described being told what to do by female staff at Epstein's properties. She described a system organized, managed, and operated largely by women. Women who are still free today. 4 women. That's how many were named as co-conspirators in the 2008 Non-Prosecution Agreement that let Jeffrey Epstein walk. 4 women who, according to federal investigators, helped run one of the most sophisticated child sex trafficking networks in American history. 4 women who received immunity from federal prosecution. 4 women who have never been charged with a single crime. Their names: Sarah Kellen, Lesley Groff, Nadia Marcinkova, Adriana Ross. This is their story. To understand how 4 women who allegedly helped traffic children walked free, you have to understand the deal. In 2008, U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta, who would later become Donald Trump's Secretary of Labor, negotiated what became known as the deal of a lifetime. Epstein had been facing a 60-count federal indictment. He could have spent the rest of his life in prison. Instead, Acosta agreed to a state plea deal, 2 counts of soliciting prostitution. 13 months in a minimum security facility. With work release. But buried in the fine print of that non-prosecution agreement was something even more extraordinary. The deal granted immunity not just to Epstein, but to, quote, 4 named co-conspirators and any potential co-conspirators. The 4 named: Sarah Kellen, Lesley Groff, Nadia Marcinkova, Adriana Ross. With one signature, Alexander Acosta shielded 4 alleged co-conspirators from federal prosecution forever. The victims were never told. The deal was negotiated in secret. And the judge was kept in the dark about the full scope of what had been agreed. Let's start with Sarah Kellen. Her job title was personal assistant. Her actual job, according to federal investigators, was something far darker. Sarah Kellen was Epstein's scheduler. She arranged his appointments. She coordinated his calendar. And according to the FBI, she called victims, young women and girls, to ask if they had, quote, new girls for Epstein. She was the one who set up the massage appointments. Massage appointments were Epstein's code for sex. She was the one who coordinated with what the FBI called the main NYC victim listed in the indictment to schedule those appointments and relay the information to Epstein. She was, in the words of a federal judge, a criminally responsible participant. In 2020, federal judge Allison Nathan made a ruling that should have ended Sarah Kellen's freedom. Judge Nathan described Kellen as, quote, a criminally responsible participant in Epstein's crimes. She went further. She described Kellen as, quote, the leader of Ghislaine Maxwell. Let that sink in. Not a follower. Not a bystander. The leader of Ghislaine Maxwell. The same Ghislaine Maxwell who is currently serving a 20-year federal prison sentence for sex trafficking. Sarah Kellen was described as her leader. And Sarah Kellen has never been charged with a single crime. When Ghislaine Maxwell went on trial in December 2021, the name Sarah Kellen came up again and again and again. More than 80 separate times. 80 times, her name surfaced in testimony and evidence in a federal sex trafficking trial. 80 times, witnesses and documents connected her to the operation. And after all of it, after 80 mentions in a federal criminal trial, Sarah Kellen walked out of that courthouse as a free woman. No charges. No indictment. No accountability. After Epstein's 2008 conviction, Sarah Kellen did what many of the fixers did. She changed her name. She became Sarah Kensington. She built a new life. She moved in different circles. And for years, she largely disappeared from public view. Then, in 2023, she married NASCAR driver Brian Vickers in a ceremony in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. But the Epstein files had other plans. When the DOJ released a new batch of files in January 2026, emails surfaced showing that Vickers had first met Kellen around 2012. In those emails, Kellen described Vickers as a, quote, major playboy. There were also emails between Vickers and Epstein directly, including a sexually explicit forwarded email that Vickers sent to Epstein in 2012. Vickers' sponsor at the time, Aaron's, allegedly wasn't pleased when it discovered his ties to Epstein. The couple divorced in spring 2024, before the files dropped. In February 2026, TMZ reported that in the divorce settlement, Sarah Kellen received a massage table, art, and other items. A massage table. On March 3, 2026, House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer sent a letter to 7 individuals requesting their testimony as part of the Epstein investigation. Sarah Kellen was one of them. The letter stated, quote, due to public reporting, documents released by the Department of Justice, and documents obtained by the committee believes you have information that will assist in its investigation. She has been asked to appear for a transcribed interview on the morning of June 3, 2026. The other 6 individuals summoned alongside her, Bill Gates, Leon Black, Doug Band, Lesley Groff, Catherine Ruemmler, Ted Waite. The fixers are finally being called to account. Now let's talk about Lesley Groff. If Sarah Kellen was the scheduler, Lesley Groff was the gatekeeper. Groff worked as Jeffrey Epstein's executive assistant for nearly 20 years. She managed his schedule. She coordinated his travel. She arranged his meetings with Yale University professors. She handled his investment opportunities. Epstein once described her as, quote, an extension of my brain. An extension of his brain. And according to the FBI, that brain was deeply embedded in a child sex trafficking network. When the Department of Justice began releasing the Epstein files, one number stopped the internet cold. Lesley Groff's name appears more than 130,000 times in the DOJ documents. 130,000 times. To put that in perspective, if you read her name once every 10 seconds, it would take you more than 14 days, without sleeping, to read it that many times. She is the most mentioned individual in the entire Epstein file archive, aside from Epstein and Maxwell themselves. And she has never been charged with a single crime. Here's what the FBI wrote about Lesley Groff in an internal email dated August 16, 2019, just weeks after Epstein's arrest. The email, which was released by the DOJ in 2026, describes a Connecticut resident who was deciding whether to cooperate with the investigation. Quote, multiple victims and cooperating co-conspirators advised, name redacted, worked out of Epstein's NYC residence as his personal assistant and was in charge of making phone calls to set up massage appointments. Quote, name redacted, would coordinate with the main NYC victim listed in the indictment, to schedule appointments and relay the information to Epstein. The name redacted in that document was later confirmed to be Lesley Groff. She was in charge of making phone calls to set up massage appointments. Massage appointments were Epstein's code for sex with minors. 3 days after Jeffrey Epstein was arrested in July 2019, FBI agents in New York sent an email asking for the, quote, status of the 10 co-conspirators in the Epstein case. One of those 10 was in Connecticut. That person was Lesley Groff. A newly unredacted DOJ file released in February 2026 confirmed it. Groff was listed alongside Ghislaine Maxwell, Jean-Luc Brunel, and Leslie Wexner as co-conspirators in an August 15, 2019 FBI document. She was served with a grand jury subpoena. And then, nothing. In 2021, prosecutors declined to charge her. When Lesley Groff's attorney learned that his client had been investigated as a co-conspirator, he issued a statement that raised more questions than it answered. Quote, Lesley Groff has never seen this document and was unaware of it. In fact, neither Lesley nor her counsel were ever notified that she was considered a co-conspirator. He continued, on the contrary, after Lesley voluntarily spoke with prosecutors and answered each and every question asked of her, she was told that she was not being prosecuted. She voluntarily spoke to prosecutors. She answered every question. And she was told she would not be prosecuted. She was not told that she had been investigated as a co-conspirator. She was not told that her name appeared in FBI documents describing her as someone who set up sex appointments with minors. She was not told any of it. And now her name appears 130,000 times in the files. On March 3, 2026, Lesley Groff received the same letter as Sarah Kellen. House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer wants her testimony. The committee is reviewing the mismanagement of the federal investigation, the circumstances of Epstein's death, the operation of sex trafficking rings, and how Epstein and Maxwell sought to curry favor with officials to protect their illegal activities. Groff has denied any knowledge of or involvement in Epstein's sex trafficking network. She has denied it for years. Now she will have to say it under oath, in front of Congress. Nadia Marcinkova arrived in the United States as a teenage model from Slovakia. She came through Jean-Luc Brunel's modeling agency, the same agency that funneled young women to Epstein from around the world. She was, according to the FBI, a victim. She was recruited, harbored, and obtained by Epstein for purposes of a coercive sexual relationship. But the story is more complicated than that. Because Florida court documents also accuse Marcinkova of participating in sex acts with minors to, quote, satisfy Epstein's criminal sexual desires. West Palm Beach victims told law enforcement they were made to have sex with Marcinkova as early as 2002, when both they and Marcinkova were potentially underage. Victim and perpetrator. Exploited and exploiter. The lines in Epstein's world were deliberately blurred. The Epstein files contain a series of emails between Epstein and Marcinkova that revealed the nature of their relationship. In 2006, when Marcinkova was 21, Epstein raged at her in an email for not recruiting girls for him. Quote, as opposed to learning to have fun fishing for girls, your focus was how disgusting the bait is. He continued, you returned from Europe, where you had totally free time, empty-handed. He was angry that she hadn't brought him new victims from her trip to Europe. In another email, he complained, you tell me you will dance, and don't. You tell me you will do fun sex things, and don't. These are the private communications of a man who ran a trafficking network, and treated the women around him as both tools and property. Around 2010, Nadia Marcinkova tried to leave Epstein. She got her own apartment. She sought independence. But Epstein kept pulling her back. And around that time, she got her pilot's license. She began flying Epstein's private jet, the aircraft that prosecutors have alleged he used to shuttle his sex trafficking victims around the globe, including to his private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The plane that became known as the Lolita Express. Nadia Marcinkova was its pilot. In 2011, she founded an aviation company called Aviloop, with financial backing from Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein's joke about it in an email, mix of porn, Groupon and flying. The marketing campaign could be, buy with us, we give a flying F-. When Epstein was arrested in 2019, Nadia Marcinkova made a different choice than Adriana Ross. She cooperated. Between 2018 and 2022, she participated in multiple telephonic and in-person meetings with the FBI's Child Exploitation and Human Trafficking Division. She provided information on both Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. In exchange, her lawyers sought the FBI's help when her visa ran out in 2022. FBI Special Agent Amanda Young wrote a letter to immigration authorities declaring Marcinkova a human trafficking victim, and urging that she could not safely return to Slovakia for fear of retaliation. Her lawyer wrote, she is finally trying to have a somewhat normal life. We really appreciate your continued help and support. She was never charged. She remains in the United States. And then there is Adriana Ross. Polish-born. Personal assistant to Epstein. Named co-conspirator in the 2008 NPA. When Ghislaine Maxwell went on trial in December 2021, Adriana Ross was called as a witness. She invoked the Fifth Amendment 27 times. 27 times, she refused to answer questions on the grounds that her answers might incriminate her. 27 times, she sat in a federal courtroom and said nothing. She has never been charged with a crime. Her current whereabouts are largely unknown. The Fifth Amendment exists to protect innocent people from self-incrimination. But when a witness invokes it 27 times in a federal sex trafficking trial, it raises a question that no one in the justice system has been willing to answer. What does Adriana Ross know? What did she do? What is she afraid to say? The answer is buried somewhere in the 99% of Epstein files that have never been released to the public. Tiffany Doe's affidavit describes being hired through a female assistant at one of Epstein's properties. She describes being told what to do by female staff. She describes a system organized, managed, and operated by women who knew exactly what they were doing. The women described in Tiffany Doe's affidavit match the profiles of Sarah Kellen and Lesley Groff almost exactly. Kellen, the scheduler, the one who made the calls, the one who set up the appointments. Groff, the gatekeeper, the one who managed the day-to-day, the one Epstein called an extension of his brain. Tiffany Doe signed her affidavit under penalty of perjury. The women she described have never been charged. Let's do the immunity math. The 2008 NPA granted immunity to 4 named co-conspirators and, quote, any potential co-conspirators. That phrase, any potential co-conspirators, is a legal force field. It means that anyone who worked for Epstein, anyone who knew about his crimes, anyone who helped in any way, was potentially shielded from prosecution by a deal that was negotiated in secret, hidden from victims, and signed by a U.S. attorney who would later become a cabinet secretary. The victims were never told. The judge was kept in the dark. And the fixers walked free. In July 2019, when Epstein was arrested for the second time, the deal of a lifetime came back to haunt Alexander Acosta. The Miami Herald had published Julie K. Brown's devastating exposé in November 2018, detailing how Acosta had given Epstein the deal of a lifetime. When the story exploded, Acosta held a press conference to defend himself. He claimed he had been told by a senior official to back off, that Epstein, quote, belonged to intelligence. He claimed the state deal was the best he could get. He resigned as Secretary of Labor on July 19, 2019. He has never been charged with any crime. The fixers he protected have never been charged with any crime. The FBI opened its investigation of Jeffrey Epstein on May 23, 2006. They called it Operation Leap Year. The lead prosecutor, Anne-Marie Villafana, prepared an 82-page prosecution memo and a 60-count draft indictment. She identified 3 of Epstein's female assistants as potential co-conspirators. She planned to approach them to obtain their cooperation against Epstein. That step was never taken. Acosta resolved the case. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the fixers may have to answer questions under oath. Here is what we know the fixers knew. Sarah Kellen knew who the victims were. She called them. She scheduled their appointments. She coordinated with the main victim listed in the federal indictment. Lesley Groff knew who the victims were. She called them. She paid them. She was the extension of Epstein's brain for nearly 20 years. Nadia Marcinkova knew who the victims were. She flew them on the Lolita Express. She was in the room. She was accused of participating in the abuse. Adriana Ross knew who the victims were. She invoked the Fifth Amendment 27 times rather than say what she knew. They all knew. Here is what none of them did. None of them went to the police. None of them contacted the FBI. None of them warned the victims. None of them tried to stop it. For years, in some cases, for decades, they kept the machine running. They scheduled the appointments. They managed the travel. They recruited the girls. They flew the plane. And when it was over, they changed their names and moved on with their lives. While the fixers rebuilt their lives, the victims lived with the consequences. Virginia Giuffre, one of the most prominent survivors, said that Epstein and Maxwell told them, "We own the police. You can't run. You can't tell anybody. We'll never be held accountable for this." They were right. For years, they were right. The fixers were never held accountable. The system that was supposed to protect the victims instead protected the perpetrators. And the victims were left to carry the weight of what was done to them, alone. Multiple Epstein victims filed civil lawsuits against the fixers. Lawsuits against Sarah Kellen. Lawsuits against Lesley Groff. All of them were dropped. The victims couldn't get justice in criminal court because the fixers had immunity. They couldn't get justice in civil court because the cases collapsed. The system failed them at every turn. Let's put this in numbers. 4 women were named as co-conspirators in the 2008 NPA. 0 of them have ever been charged with a crime. 80 times Sarah Kellen was named at the Maxwell trial. 130,000 times Lesley Groff appears in the DOJ files. 27 times Adriana Ross invoked the Fifth Amendment. 18 years Lesley Groff worked for Epstein. 13 months Epstein served in a minimum security facility, with work release. Less than 1% of the Epstein files have been released to the public. June 3, 2026, the date Sarah Kellen is scheduled to testify before Congress. Throughout this series, we have returned again and again to Tiffany Doe. Her affidavit is the thread that connects everything. She describes the parties. She describes the participants. She describes the system. And she describes the women who ran it. Women who called themselves assistants. Women who called themselves schedulers. Women who called themselves pilots. Women who, according to federal investigators, were co-conspirators in one of the most extensive child sex trafficking networks in American history. Tiffany Doe signed her name, her pseudonym, to a document that could send people to prison. The women she described have never been charged. Here is the question that no one in the justice system has been willing to answer. If Sarah Kellen was described by a federal judge as a criminally responsible participant and the leader of Ghislaine Maxwell? And Ghislaine Maxwell is serving 20 years in federal prison. Why is Sarah Kellen free? If Lesley Groff's name appears 130,000 times in the DOJ files, and FBI documents describe her calling victims to ask if they had new girls, why is Lesley Groff free? If Adriana Ross invoked the Fifth Amendment 27 times in a federal sex trafficking trial, why has no one pursued what she is hiding? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that the victims have been asking for 20 years. The answer, in part, is the immunity shield. The 2008 Non-Prosecution Agreement granted immunity to 4 named co-conspirators and any potential co-conspirators. That immunity has never been successfully challenged. Even after Epstein's 2019 arrest and death. Even after Maxwell's conviction. Even after the DOJ files revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. The fixers remain protected by a deal that was negotiated in secret, hidden from victims, and signed by a man who later resigned in disgrace. The immunity shield is still standing. In January 2025, President Donald Trump signed an executive order directing the release of the Epstein files. The order was celebrated as a breakthrough. But by early 2026, less than 1% of the files had been released. The DOJ has continued to withhold the vast majority of the archive. The fixers' full roles remain hidden in documents that the public has never seen. The cover-up continues. Let's put this on a timeline. 2003, Sarah Kellen begins working for Epstein. Lesley Groff has already been working for him for years. 2006, FBI opens Operation Leap Year. Identifies 3 female assistants as potential co-conspirators. 2008, NPA signed. 4 women receive immunity. Epstein serves 13 months. 2019, Epstein arrested. FBI investigates 10 co-conspirators. Groff is one of them. Epstein dies in custody. 2021, Maxwell convicted. Kellen named 80 times at trial. Prosecutors declined to charge Groff. 2024 to 2026, DOJ files released. Groff named 130,000 times. Kellen's divorce reveals massage table in settlement. March 2026, House Oversight Committee summons Kellen and Groff to testify. June 2026, scheduled testimony date. 20 years. 0 charges. What would justice look like for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein? It would look like Sarah Kellen answering, under oath, every question about every appointment she scheduled. It would look like Lesley Groff explaining, under oath, every phone call she made to every victim. It would look like Adriana Ross answering, under oath, the 27 questions she refused to answer at the Maxwell trial. It would look like the full release of the Epstein files, all of them, not 1%. It would look like the immunity deal being re-examined in the light of everything we now know. It would look like the victims being believed. It would look like accountability. The fixers ran the day-to-day operations. But who were the clients? In Part 6 of the Epstein files, Billionaires, Blackmail and Betrayal, we go to the top. Bill Gates. Howard Lutnick. Leon Black. Richard Branson. The men who flew on the Lolita Express. The men who visited the island. The men who are now being called to testify. Part 6, The Billionaire Boys Club. Coming next. If this episode opened your eyes, share it. The victims of Jeffrey Epstein have been waiting for justice for 20 years. The least we can do is make sure the world knows their names. Subscribe to the Epstein Files, Billionaires, Blackmail and Betrayal on the WordUp Media Network. Like, share, comment, and most importantly, demand answers. The fixers are finally being called to testify. The question is whether anyone will hold them accountable. We will be watching. Part 5, The Fixers. All facts sourced from public court records, DOJ files, congressional documents, and verified reporting.